You think you know what religious persecution looks like in history, but what if I told you that Christian Inquisitions didn't just target heretics and witches? They systematically tortured and murdered enslaved people in ways that would make medieval executioners look merciful. If you enjoy stories like these, consider subscribing and commenting where you're watching from. It helps us create more historical content. Picture this scene from colonial Brazil in 1591. Rosa Egipciaca, a formerly enslaved woman, sits chained in a stone cell beneath the Inquisition tribunal in Salvador. Her crime wasn't theft or rebellion. Her crime was practicing the African spiritual traditions her ancestors brought across the Atlantic. The same traditions that helped her survive the horrors of slavery. Tomorrow she'll face interrogators who will use techniques perfected over centuries to break both her body and her spirit. What happens next represents one of the most systematic campaigns of religious terror ever unleashed upon enslaved populations. Today we're diving into the darkest intersection of religious authority and human bondage. A story so disturbing that historians spent centuries trying to minimize its scope. We're talking about documented evidence from Inquisition archives across 3 continents spanning over 300 years. Primary sources that reveal how Christian institutions didn't just tolerate slavery, they weaponized their spiritual authority to inflict unimaginable suffering on millions of enslaved people. This isn't just about individual cruelty, this is about systematic religious terror that operated with the full blessing of the Catholic Church. From the torture chambers of Lima to the burning squares of Mexico City, from the sugar plantations of Barbados to the colonial settlements of Brazil, Christian Inquisitions created a machinery of suffering that targeted the most vulnerable people in society. But here's what makes this history even more chilling. These weren't random acts of violence by rogue officials. These were calculated policies designed to destroy African spiritual practices, break family bonds, and ensure that enslaved people remained not just physically bound, but spiritually broken. The Inquisition understood something that modern oppressors still recognize today. Control the soul, and you control everything. The Portuguese Inquisition's expansion into Brazil created the perfect storm of religious persecution and racial oppression. When inquisitors arrived in the New World, they didn't just bring their torture devices and legal procedures. They brought a theological framework that classified enslaved Africans as spiritually inferior beings whose very existence threatened Christian orthodoxy. The numbers alone should shock you. The Inquisition operated in Brazil for over 2 centuries, from 1591 to 1821. During this time, thousands of enslaved people faced charges of heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy. But these weren't crimes in any meaningful sense. These were cultural practices, spiritual beliefs, and survival mechanisms that enslaved communities used to maintain their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Take the case of practitioners of African diasporic religions, enslaved people who maintained connections to Yoruba, Bantu, or other traditional spiritual systems found themselves dragged before Inquisition tribunals. Their ceremonies were labelled devil worship. Their healing practices became witchcraft. Their community gatherings transformed into evidence of heretical conspiracy. The theological justification was as twisted as it was comprehensive. Inquisitors argued that enslaved Africans were naturally prone to demonic influence because of their supposed spiritual inferiority. This created a catch-22 that would be almost laughable if it weren't so horrific. Enslaved people who converted to Christianity faced suspicion of false conversion. Those who maintained traditional beliefs faced charges of heresy. Either way led to the torture chamber. But the Portuguese Inquisition went beyond targeting individual practitioners. They systematically dismantled the cultural and spiritual infrastructure that allowed enslaved communities to survive. Sacred objects were confiscated and burned, Traditional healers were executed as witches. Community leaders disappeared into Inquisition prisons, never to return. The intersection with slavery created unique horrors that pure religious persecution couldn't match. When a free person faced Inquisition charges, they might lose property or social standing. When an enslaved person faced the same charges, they lost everything while having nothing to begin with. They faced torture, not just for their alleged crimes, but as someone else's property being damaged in the process. This economic dimension added layers of cruelty that historians are only beginning to understand. Slaveholders could use Inquisition accusations as tools of control. An enslaved person who showed signs of resistance or independence might suddenly face charges of practicing witchcraft. The threat of Inquisition investigation became another whip in the overseer's collection. The case of Rosa Egipciaca illustrates how these systems worked in practice. Born into slavery, she survived prostitution and abuse to become a religious mystic whose visions attracted followers across racial lines. Her crime wasn't practicing African religion, it was creating a spiritual movement that transcended the racial boundaries slavery depended upon. When inquisitors arrested Rosa in 1762, they weren't just targeting one woman's beliefs, they were dismantling a spiritual community that offered enslaved people hope beyond their immediate circumstances. Her interrogation and imprisonment sent a clear message to enslaved communities across Brazil. Your spirits, your dreams, your connections to each other and to the divine, all of these belong to us. The torture methods used against enslaved people combine the Inquisition's refined techniques with the casual brutality of plantation punishment. We're talking about waterboarding, suspension torture, and burning, applied to people whose bodies already bore the scars of whips and brands. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Interrogators used family members as leverage, threatening to extend punishments to children and spouses. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was how the Inquisition corrupted the very concept of spiritual salvation for enslaved people. Christianity was often presented to enslaved communities as offering hope for freedom in the afterlife. The Inquisition perverted this message by making Christian salvation conditional on absolute submission not just to God, but to earthly masters. This created a spiritual prison that paralleled physical bondage. Enslaved people found themselves caught between traditional beliefs that connected them to ancestral wisdom and family heritage, and a Christianity that demanded they abandon these connections as evil. The choice wasn't between different religious paths, it was between spiritual authenticity and physical survival. The documentation of these practices comes from the Inquisition's own meticulous record-keeping. These weren't secrets hidden from history, they were official policies, carefully documented and preserved in archives that scholars can access today. The casual tone of these records might be the most disturbing aspect of all. Scribes recorded the torture of enslaved people with the same bureaucratic efficiency they use for recording property transfers. Human suffering became administrative detail. Lives destroyed through systematic terror were reduced to case numbers and filing categories. What emerges from these archives is a picture of institutional evil so comprehensive that it challenges our understanding of both religious persecution and slavery. This wasn't just the Catholic Church tolerating slavery. This was the Catholic Church actively using its spiritual authority to make slavery more brutal, more total, and more psychologically devastating. The geographic scope reveals the systematic nature of these practices. From the sugar plantations of Barbados to the silver mines of Peru, from the coffee fazendas of Brazil to the tobacco fields of Mexico, Inquisition tribunals operated wherever enslaved people might find moments of spiritual autonomy or cultural connection. Each location developed variations adapted to local conditions, but the core strategy remained consistent. Identify spiritual practices that gave enslaved people strength or community. Classify these practices as heretical or demonic. Use the full machinery of Inquisition terror to eliminate them. Replace them with a Christianity so thoroughly corrupted by slavery that it became another tool of oppression. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual victims. Entire communities lived under the constant threat that their spiritual practices, their family gatherings, even their private prayers might be interpreted as evidence of heresy. This created a climate of spiritual terror that complemented the physical terror of slavery itself. Children were torn from their mothers' arms, not just to be sold, but to be systematically reprogrammed in ways that would make modern cult deprogramming look gentle. The Spanish Inquisition in Mexico developed what they called spiritual cleansing programs, specifically designed for enslaved children. These weren't education programs. These were psychological warfare campaigns targeting the most vulnerable minds in colonial society. The process began with complete isolation from any adult who might maintain cultural connections. Enslaved children, as young as 5, were separated from their families and placed in Inquisition-run institutions where Spanish became their only permitted language. Speaking in their native tongues resulted in physical punishment so severe that many children developed permanent speech impediments from the trauma. But language was just the beginning. These children were forced to participate in ceremonies designed to humiliate and destroy their cultural heritage. They were made to burn objects that reminded them of home, to repeat prayers denouncing their ancestors as demons, to participate in mock trials where they accused their own parents of heretical practices. The truly twisted genius of this system was how it turned children into weapons against their own communities. After months or years of this treatment, these children were returned to enslaved quarters as informants. They had been so thoroughly broken and reprogrammed that they would report on spiritual practices, family gatherings, even private conversations that might indicate resistance to Christian authority. One documented case from 1634 describes a 10-year-old boy named Miguel who was taken from his mother on a Jesuit plantation in Peru. After 18 months in an Inquisition facility, he returned speaking only Spanish and immediately reported his mother for singing what he called devil songs while working in the fields. These were lullabies she had sung to him as a baby. His testimony led to her execution by burning. The psychological destruction was so complete that many of these children never recovered their ability to form emotional connections with their birth families. They had been programmed to see love and cultural connection as spiritual corruption. Some became Inquisition officials themselves, using their intimate knowledge of enslaved communities to identify and destroy the very practices that had once given their people strength. The branding practices at Christian institutions represent perhaps the most literal intersection of religious symbolism and human ownership in recorded history. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts didn't just own enslaved people on their Barbados plantations, they turned human flesh into religious billboard advertising. Picture this scene from 1715. Newly arrived Africans, still traumatized from the Middle Passage, are lined up outside the plantation chapel. One by one, they're held down, while red-hot iron brands sear the word society into their chests. The smell of burning flesh mingles with incense from Sunday services. The screams of agony echo off chapel walls, decorated with crosses and biblical verses about love and salvation. This wasn't random cruelty. This was calculated religious theatre designed to demonstrate absolute ownership, not just of bodies, but of souls. Every time these enslaved people looked in a mirror or bathed, they saw a Christian organization's name burned into their skin. Every time other enslaved people saw these brands, they received a clear message about who owned them and by what authority. The branding ceremonies themselves became ritualized events that plantation owners and church officials attended as entertainment. Detailed records describe how these sessions were scheduled around religious holidays to maximize their symbolic impact. Easter brands were considered especially meaningful because they represented the resurrection of African souls into Christian servitude. But the psychological warfare went deeper than physical marking. The same religious institutions that branded human flesh also controlled access to salvation. Enslaved people were taught that their eternal souls belonged to the same organization that had literally branded their bodies. Resistance to earthly masters became resistance to divine will. The Codrington plantations operated for over a century with this system, producing profits that funded missionary work across the Caribbean. Church officials wrote glowing reports about how plantation revenues were spreading the gospel to heathen lands, never mentioning that this gospel was being spread with money earned from people whose bodies bore the church's brand marks. The torture methods used specifically against enslaved people combined Inquisition techniques with plantation punishments in ways that created entirely new categories of suffering. The strapado, where victims were suspended by their arms tied behind their backs, became even more horrific when applied to people whose bodies already bore whip scars and brand marks. But inquisitors developed specialized techniques for enslaved victims that free people never faced. One method involved forcing enslaved people to watch the torture of their family members while being told that conversion to approved Christianity could stop the suffering. Parents were made to choose between maintaining their spiritual beliefs and watching their children tortured to death. The waterboarding technique known as toca was modified for enslaved victims by incorporating elements of plantation punishment. Victims would be subjected to near drowning while being forced to repeat Christian prayers, denouncing their African heritage. The combination of physical torture with spiritual humiliation created psychological breaks that often proved permanent. Documentation from the Lima Tribunal describes a torture session involving an enslaved woman named Esperanza, who had been accused of practicing traditional healing. She was subjected to the rope torture while interrogators demanded she identify other members of her spiritual community. When she refused, they brought in her teenage daughter and began applying the same torture while forcing Esperanza to watch. The transcripts record her breaking point. After watching her daughter suspended and tortured for 2 hours, Esperanza began naming everyone she knew who had ever participated in traditional ceremonies, sung African songs, or maintained cultural practices. Her testimony led to the arrest and torture of 43 other enslaved people across multiple plantations. But here's the most disturbing part. The Inquisition records show that Esperanza's daughter died from her injuries 3 days later. The interrogators noted this death as a minor administrative detail while using Esperanza's forced testimony to justify 43 more torture sessions. One child's death became the foundation for months of systematic terror across the enslaved community. The family separation tactics used by Inquisition officials were specifically designed to destroy the kinship networks that allowed enslaved communities to survive. Unlike the random family separations common in slave sales, Inquisition separations targeted specific family structures that showed signs of cultural resistance or spiritual independence. Families that maintained traditional naming practices found their children removed and placed with Christian families who would provide proper spiritual guidance. Couples who had married according to African customs were declared to be living in sin and forcibly separated. Extended family networks that supported traditional healing or spiritual practices were systematically dismantled through strategic relocations and separations. The documentation shows that Inquisition officials studied enslaved family structures with the same attention they gave to mapping heretical networks among free populations. They identified spiritual leaders, traditional healers, storytellers, and cultural teachers, then used family separation as a weapon to isolate these individuals from their sources of community support. One case from colonial Mexico describes how Inquisition officials tracked 3 generations of an enslaved family that had maintained traditional pottery-making techniques passed down from their African ancestors. The pottery itself wasn't considered heretical, but the songs, stories, and spiritual practices associated with its creation were classified as demonic influences. The solution was surgical family destruction. The grandmother who taught the techniques was sold to a plantation 300 miles away. The mother who led the singing was executed for witchcraft. The children were placed in Christian households where they would learn proper spiritual practices. Within 1 generation, pottery techniques that had survived the Middle Passage and decades of slavery were completely eliminated. These weren't isolated incidents. Archives contain thousands of cases where Inquisition officials used their authority to destroy enslaved families, specifically to eliminate cultural practices. The efficiency was remarkable and terrifying. Identify cultural transmission, isolate the transmitters, eliminate the knowledge, prevent its regeneration. The economic incentives made this destruction even more systematic. Slaveholders could petition Inquisition tribunals to investigate enslaved people who were becoming too independent or showing signs of cultural pride. A successful heresy conviction could justify family separations that might otherwise face community resistance. This created a feedback loop where slavery and Inquisition terror reinforced each other in ways that made both systems more brutal and more total than either could have been alone. Enslaved people faced not just physical bondage and economic exploitation, but systematic spiritual warfare designed to eliminate every trace of cultural identity and family connection that might provide psychological resistance to their condition. The archives reveal that this wasn't accidental convergence of 2 oppressive systems. This was deliberate policy coordination between religious and civil authorities who understood that controlling souls was more effective than just controlling bodies.